A girl's body was found in a cramped bedroom in a provincial home. Signs of a struggle, blood on the walls, and a silence in which only the truth remained. A forbidden relationship with her stepfather had ended in a brutal murder. A family that once seemed ordinary found itself at the center of a terrible tragedy. From the outside, the family home looked perfectly ordinary. A small two-story cottage in the American suburbs, a neat yard, and neighbors who knew the girl's mother as a hard-working woman. She raised her daughter alone before meeting her future husband. Her life seemed orderly: a job at the local pharmacy, evening chores, and occasional get-togethers with friends. When a man several years older than her entered her life, her acquaintances perceived it as a chance for new stability. He worked as a mechanic at a car repair shop and was known as a taciturn but responsible man. The relationship developed quickly. The woman believed she could build a peaceful family with this man. The girl, her daughter, was a senior in high school at the time. To those around her, everything seemed harmonious. The stepfather helped with her homework, drove her to school, and paid attention to the little things. Neighbors noted that he seemed caring and even gentle in his interactions. But behind closed doors, life was different. At first, everything went unnoticed. The girl spent a lot of time on her phone, became secretive, and avoided talking to her mother. Her mother attributed this to adolescence. However, her stepfather increasingly found excuses to be alone with the girl. They watched movies together, discussed music, and spent time in the garage. At first, there was nothing suspicious about it, but gradually, the distance between them narrowed. It later emerged that it was during this period that the secret affair began. None of her acquaintances suspected what was going on. It would have been a shock to her mother, but she knew nothing at the time. The girl found support in her stepfather, an adult figure she trusted. He, however, became increasingly engrossed in his new role, that of patron and secret partner. The first warning signs did appear. Classmates noticed that the girl had become nervous, could suddenly flare up or become withdrawn. Teachers reported a decline in her grades. Friends noted changes in her behavior, but were unsure of the cause. In the rare conversations with her mother, the daughter became irritable, answered in monosyllables, and avoided eye contact. The mother's concern began when she noticed her husband was too often defending her in domestic conflicts. He excused her lateness and turned a blind eye to her insolence. Later, the woman confessed to investigators. She had a vague feeling that something was wrong between them, but at the time, she had no evidence. Meanwhile, the secret affair continued. The girl found attention and care in her stepfather, which she interpreted as expressions of love. He, however, justified his actions by claiming that their relationship was a secret. This relationship grew stronger, undermining the family's internal foundations. The investigation would later establish that it was during this period that tensions in the home began to mount. The mother increasingly felt isolated. Neighbors heard arguments, even though the family had recently seemed exemplary. The first chapter of the story ends at a point where the hidden affair was already underway, but remained secret. It poisoned the relationships in the home, creating a hidden tension that would ultimately lead to tragic consequences. The tension in the family grew gradually, like a subtle fire that first smolders within the walls and then engulfs the entire building. By the time the tragic events began, the relationship between mother, daughter, and stepfather had already become extremely strained. From the outside, the house appeared calm, but behind closed doors, aggression and hidden hostility were brewing. The mother increasingly noticed changes in her husband's behavior. He became irritable and withdrawn, spending much time alone with his stepdaughter, justifying it with concern. In the evenings, he avoided conversations with his wife, and when he did engage in them, his responses were dry and cold. The woman tried to restore the usual routine. She hosted family dinners and invited neighbors. But each time, she felt an invisible wall had risen between her and her loved ones. The daughter, now almost an adult, increasingly clashed with her mother. The arguments began over trivial matters: uncollected dishes, late arrivals, refusal to help around the house. But gradually, these arguments took on a distinctive boldness that hadn't been there before. The girl made harsh remarks, and looked at her mother defiantly, as if seeking a pretext for confrontation. Investigators would later determine that it was during this period that her mother began to notice her daughter and her husband exchanging glances that couldn't be explained by chance. The situation was complicated by the fact that close family friends began to notice strange behavior. One neighbor, who often saw the stepdaughter and stepfather together, told the police that they seemed too close. No one took her words seriously at the time, but they later became the basis for suspicion. The atmosphere within the house became increasingly volatile. The mother tried several times to speak directly with her husband, but each time she received the same responses. "You're making this up. She's just growing up. These are temporary difficulties." The girl, for her part, categorically denied any suspicions. This was becoming a severe psychological ordeal for the mother. She felt she was losing her authority and control over what was happening. Conflicts escalated into protracted arguments. One evening, neighbors heard loud screams coming from the house. The police weren't called at the time, but witnesses later claimed the mother was screaming about betrayal and lies. This was the first serious episode when a secret affair between stepfather and stepdaughter almost came to light. At the same time, the pressure on the girl herself intensified. On the one hand, she felt the power of an older man who knew how to instill in her a sense of dependence. On the other, she understood that their relationship was illegal and dangerous. The internal conflict resulted in nervous breakdowns. Teachers noted that she stopped attending classes, spending hours on her phone, or simply staring out the window, ignoring the lessons. By the end of this period, the mother was finally convinced that something terrible was happening in her house. She began sharing her suspicions with her friends, and once even hinted to a colleague that her husband was cheating on her. But she still didn't know the real picture. The investigation will subsequently record the mother's testimony, in which she admits that it was then that she considered seeking help from a psychologist or the police. But the resolve never materialized. The woman tried to keep the family together, hoping that the crisis could be overcome. This decision proved fatal. Tensions continued to mount, and each new argument made the home a dangerous place. The girl felt her secret was about to be revealed, and her stepfather felt the situation was spiraling out of control. This period would become the final step toward tragedy. The family found itself in a dead end from which no one could find a way out. The final days before the murder were marked by increasing instability and a series of events that investigators later deemed precursors to the tragedy. The chronology of this period was constructed from the testimony of witnesses, neighbors, and family acquaintances, as well as phone and diary entries. Every detail indicated that the family was living in a state of profound internal war. A week before the crime, the mother publicly accused her husband of infidelity for the first time. The argument occurred late at night and was accompanied by screams heard by neighbors. The woman, it would later be established, found messages written to her daughter on her husband's phone. Although the contents of the messages had been partially deleted, she had no doubt that their relationship was beyond ordinary. The husband denied the accusations, accused his wife of jealousy, and tried to dismiss the whole affair as a misunderstanding. But from that moment on, the atmosphere in the home became decidedly hostile. The daughter found herself at the center of a conflict. She felt increasingly suspicious of her mother and responded aggressively to any approach. She complained to her friends that it was impossible to be at home and considered moving in with friends. Her behavior showed growing nervousness. She stopped attending classes, spent a lot of time texting, and sometimes went for long periods without answering calls. 3 days before the murder, the mother attempted to speak with her daughter alone. The conversation, according to the woman, ended in a heated argument. Her daughter accused her of misunderstanding her, screaming that she was no longer a child and had a right to her own life. This episode marked the last time the mother attempted to salvage the relationship. The next day, the stepfather left with his stepdaughter for a neighboring town under the pretext of shopping. According to surveillance footage, they spent several hours together. Later, the investigation would establish that it was on that day that he purchased the tools and materials he later used to cover up the crime. To those around him, it seemed like a routine trip, but the fact itself raised eyebrows. The mother was unaware of it and only learned about it after her return. The evening before the murder, another conflict erupted in the house. This time, it ended with the mother leaving the house and going to her sister's. She stayed there all night, hoping a break would ease the tension. In her absence, the stepfather and stepdaughter were left alone. This circumstance would later become key in reconstructing the events. The last day before the tragedy was seemingly calm. Neighbors saw her stepfather in the yard, working on his car. The girl spent most of her time in her room. That evening, her mother returned home. According to her, the atmosphere was tense but outwardly calm. However, that night, the quarrels continued. It was during this time that the stepfather, realizing that the secret was about to become public knowledge, decided to eliminate his stepdaughter. The investigation would later establish that he was preparing the crime scene during those hours. Evidence indicated objects being moved around the house and weapons being prepared in advance. At the time, the girl was texting a friend, complaining of pressure and hinting that things are really bad at home. This was her last message. A combination of factors, the mother's suspicions, open conflict, and fear of exposure, made the murder inevitable. For the stepfather, the threat of exposure meant not only the end of the marriage but also criminal prosecution. The psychological pressure on him reached its peak, and he made a choice that would lead to irreparable consequences. The final hours before the crime pass in an atmosphere of silent tension. From the outside, the house appears quiet, but inside, everyone involved senses the situation has reached breaking point. The very next morning, the silence will be broken by screams and a call to the police, the culmination of a conflict that had been building for months. Investigators reconstructed the night of the murder using video from nearby buildings, telephone records, and the mother's testimony. This allowed them to reconstruct the events almost minute by minute. According to the case file, around midnight, another argument broke out in the house. Initially, it was between mother and daughter, but the stepfather soon intervened. The woman claimed he was acting unusually aggressive, accusing her of constant nagging and reproaches. Instead of supporting her mother, the daughter sided with him. The conflict quickly escalated into shouting matches. At some point, the mother lost her temper and went into the bedroom, leaving the two of them in the living room. This proved to be a fatal mistake. What happened next is known from the evidence collected. A heated argument broke out in the room. The girl demanded that he stop pressuring her and openly admit their relationship, while the stepfather insisted on keeping it a secret and accused her of being the one who made her mother suspect something. The argument escalated into a physical fight. Blood stains from the initial blows were later found on the walls. The investigation determined that the stepfather had used a previously prepared weapon, a metal object from the garage. The blow was delivered to the head. The girl fell but was still alive. His subsequent actions clearly indicated a cover-up. He inflicted several more blows, then dragged the body into the bedroom, where he attempted to stage a suicide. However, this was done carelessly. Evidence pointed to a struggle, and the nature of the wounds completely ruled out suicide. The mother, who was in the next room, heard the noise and ran out into the hallway. She saw a scene of struggle, her daughter lying on the floor, her stepfather standing nearby, bloodied and in shock. The woman screamed, ran to the phone, and called the police. The man tried to push her away and dissuade her from calling, claiming it was an accident. But the call had already been made, and a few minutes later, the first patrol arrived on the scene. The police documented a chaotic scene, scattered objects, traces of blood on the walls, and the girl's body partially covered with a blanket. The stepfather was detained at the scene. He offered no resistance, but attempted to explain the incident as an accident during a family dispute. However, the initial examination contradicted his account. Forensic experts noted numerous signs of a struggle: broken furniture, abrasions on the victim's hands, and her fingernail marks on her stepfather's skin. All of this indicated she had tried to defend herself. The murder weapon, which had fingerprints on it, was seized from the house. The investigation began immediately. Neighbors were questioned that same night. They confirmed hearing screams and noise, but did not intervene, believing it was just another family quarrel. Investigators simultaneously began examining the phones. Text messages between the stepfather and stepdaughter clearly indicated a close relationship. This evidence became key in forming the main theory. The murder stemmed from personal and illicit relationships. A post-mortem examination determined that death was caused by traumatic brain injury resulting from multiple blows. Furthermore, traces of long-standing bruises were found on the girl's body, indirectly indicating regular conflicts. For the mother, that night was a turning point. She lost her daughter and simultaneously realized the true nature of her husband. Her initial testimony was contradictory. She was in a state of shock, yet she described the arguments and her suspicions that had been building for months. Immediately after his arrest, the stepfather was placed in a holding cell. During interrogation, he initially claimed to have acted in a state of passion, then tried to deny intent, but under the weight of the evidence, he was forced to admit to the assault. However, he steadfastly denied any affair with his stepdaughter, despite clear evidence. The police officially announced they had opened a criminal case for premeditated murder. The case sparked widespread public outcry. The media picked up on the story, highlighting the perversity of the situation, an affair between a stepfather and stepdaughter that ended in bloody tragedy. Thus began the next stage, the trial, where all the family's hidden secrets became public knowledge. The stepfather's trial began several months after the murder. During this time, investigators completed the collection of evidence, conducted forensic examinations, and drafted the indictment. The case generated widespread coverage in local media, with journalists highlighting the unusual circumstances, a forbidden romance, and a tragic ending that resulted in the death of an underage girl. The courtroom was packed at the first hearing. Relatives, neighbors, journalists, and even random onlookers, drawn by the sensational story, were present. The defendant was led out in handcuffs, looking exhausted but maintaining a calm demeanor. His lawyer stated that he intended to base his defense on the theory of passion, that the murder had occurred as a result of a sudden argument, without premeditation. The prosecutor responded by emphasizing that the investigation had evidence of preparation. The acquisition of the murder weapon shortly before the tragedy, correspondence confirming a secret relationship, and the defendant's behavior after the crime. He attempted to stage a suicide, indicating an attempt to conceal his actions. All of this, according to the prosecution, indicated a premeditated nature. The girl's mother testified as the star witness. Her testimony was a difficult ordeal. She described in detail the arguments, the suspicions, and the night she saw her husband next to her daughter's body. She didn't hide her tears, but her words were clear. She confirmed that she had repeatedly suspected intimacy between her husband and daughter, but had no proof until the very end. Neighbors were also heard. They confirmed that they had frequently heard shouting and arguing in the house over the past few months. Some recalled seeing the stepfather and stepdaughter together in situations that seemed too intimate for a normal relationship. School teachers also testified, mentioning changes in the girl's behavior, her nervousness, and a decline in her grades. The key point was the forensic analysis of the phones. The messages indicated a personal and intimate relationship between the stepfather and stepdaughter. Although the defendant denied it to the end, the content of the messages was unambiguous. The forensic analysis confirmed their authenticity, despite attempts to delete them. The pathologist also presented his conclusion. He confirmed that death was caused by multiple blows to the head with a metal object. The nature of the injuries indicated a series of targeted blows, not a single impulsive act. Furthermore, traces of recent bruises and abrasions were found on the girl's body, indicating repeated physical abuse. The defendant's lawyer attempted to build a defense based on claims that the blows were inflicted in a state of extreme emotional distress and that the defendant was unaware of his actions. However, the sequence of events and his actions after the murder spoke against him. The court took into account both the attempt to stage a suicide and the attempt to persuade his wife not to call the police. All of this indicated that the defendant understood the nature of his actions. The court hearings lasted for several weeks. The press covered the case in detail every day, publishing articles and expert commentary. The story sparked heated debate about domestic violence, hidden connections, and how long such situations can go undetected. At the end of the trial, the court heard the defendant's final statement. He again denied having an affair with his stepdaughter, claiming the incident was an accident. However, the court found him guilty of premeditated murder. The sentence was harsh, a long prison term with no possibility of parole for decades to come. Reaction to the verdict was mixed. The victim's relatives considered it fair and deserved. The defendant's lawyer announced his intention to appeal, but there were no compelling grounds for an appeal. For the mother, the verdict was final. She lost both her daughter and her husband, and her life was ruined. The media followed her fate for a while, but interest in the case eventually faded. The case ended legally, but the consequences of the tragedy remained. The case was discussed for a long time in society as an example of what can happen when family conflicts, secret relationships, and a lack of timely intervention combine. A family shattered by a secret affair became the scene of a crime that shocked the public. The daughter lost her life, the stepfather received a lengthy prison sentence, and the mother was left with tragedy and emptiness. The story ended in court, but its aftermath reverberated long afterward in the memories of family and neighbors.